Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for our webinar on congenital myasthenic syndromes. We will just give people a few minutes to join us and then we'll get started. So we're really grateful today to be joined by a fantastic panel. So I've just shared their details there, but once we actually start the webinar, we'll introduce everyone. Okay, I can just see that the numbers are going up, so people are just joining us at the moment. And just while we're waiting on people joining us, I'm just sharing the details of our helpline, which is open Monday to Thursday, 10 AM to 2 PM. So you can contact us for support or information on 0800 652 6352, or you can email us at info@musculardystrophyuk.org. You can also contact our research line if you have any questions around research via email. So I'll just sharing their contact details as well. I'll just stop sharing my screen now. I think that's everyone joining us. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's virtual information webinar on congenital myasthenic syndromes. I'm Jackie Monroe and I'm Head of Regional Support Outreach and Information at Muscular Dystrophy UK. I'm chairing today's session along with my colleague, Dr. Charlotte Roy, who's MD UK's Research Communications Manager. If you have any questions about the session content, you're welcome to get in contact with either of us directly. So we're delighted you could join us for what promises to be an informative and valuable session. We have a very packed agenda this morning with a fantastic array of speakers. We're going to split the session into two parts, beginning with a discussion on research and a chance to ask any questions that you might have on that topic. We'll then move on to discuss living with congenital myasthenic syndromes, where we'll have a general discussion and focus on answering your questions. So throughout the seminar, please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll cover as many as we can, including those submitted in advance. Unfortunately, we won't be able to invite people to speak directly, but we will try and make sure questions are brought into the discussion during the seminar. If we're unable to answer your questions during the session, we'll aim to follow up with you afterwards and share additional information on our website. So while we'll do our best to cover as much as possible, some specific or personal questions might be better addressed by your clinical team or neuromuscular specialist. So the session's intended to provide general information, but it doesn't replace individual medical advice. So just a reminder that our helpline is available to support anyone affected by muscle wasting conditions. Whether you have questions, need advice, or are looking for support, we're here to help. So as I mentioned at the beginning, you can reach us on 0800 652 6352 or via email at info@musculardystrophyuk.org. So today's seminar has been recorded and the video will be made available on our website and our YouTube channel in the coming days. So I'll just hand over to Charlotte, who will be chairing the first part of today's session. And to start us off this morning, Charlotte will introduce our first speaker.
Morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. So we're kicking off the session with research, and we'll start off with Dr. Sitara Ramdas, who is a consultant paediatric neurologist at Oxford Children's Hospital and honorary senior clinical lecturer at the University of Oxford. And she'll be providing some insights into current treatment options, clinical trials, and diagnostic approaches in CMS. Thanks, Sitara.
Thanks, Charlotte. I'll just share my screen. Is that in presenter mode? Yeah, okay, great, perfect. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar on CMS, and thank you to MD UK for organizing this webinar on a condition which is rare, but it's something several of us in Oxford are quite passionate about. So just a bit of reminder, what is myasthenia? So myasthenia is split into two words. So my means a person, and asthenia. And asthenia comes from a Greek word which means loss of strength and which is weakness. And really what you see in myasthenia is you get the message, which is transmission across the nerve muscle junction is not working perfectly. And that can be due to a genetic problem or an immune problem. And on your top right-hand corner here is an image of the neuromuscular junction under the microscope, with the green is the nerve part of it and the red is the muscle side. So what happens when a message comes across the nerve? So when the message comes across the nerve, you get these pockets of acetylcholine, which is a chemical which is released from the nerve side. And these acetylcholine then attaches to a receptor called acetylcholine receptor on the muscle side. And this causes the muscle to contract, move. This acetylcholine is then repackaged by the body with an enzyme called as acetylcholine esterase back to the nerve terminal, and this process and it's reproduced again. So this process continues when muscle contraction happens. In addition, there are some additional other proteins which are really quite important for this effective nerve-muscle junction transmission. And some are what we call glucose molecules, sugar molecules, which are important in a process called glycosylation, and they help the receptors form properly. And then we've got these proteins called agrin, musk, DOX7, which are really important because they work together with another protein called rhabsin to bring these receptors together. And these receptors coming together is an important process in how effectively the nerve and the muscle talk to each other and the transmission goes well. So that's a bit of sort of physiology of what actually happens when there is normal nerve muscle junction transmission. So when we think about myasthenia in child, we've got two broad categories. So we've got the congenital myasthenic syndrome, which is the genetic form of myasthenia, and then we've got myasthenia gravis, which is an immune form of myasthenia. And today we're going to talk about the genetic form. So CMS was actually first recognized as an entity about 60 years ago. It's a rare condition, and in the UK, the incidence is about 9.2 cases per million in children under 18 years. We felt there was quite a lot of underdiagnosis of these patients because you can have very mild symptoms, but with better access to genetic testing, we are picking up these cases much earlier. Most CMS patients have what we call autosomal recessive inheritance, wherein a child or an individual has 2 copies of a gene and both the copies are faulty. And they tend to get one faulty copy from each parent, but because the parent has a normal copy, the parent doesn't have symptoms. But there are few CMSs where only fault in one copy of the gene can be defective, and that's called as autosomal dominant. So what age do CMS patients present? So this is some data from our cohort in Oxford. We've got about 250 patients. And as you can see here, most patients present at birth or at least in the first year of life. But what's important is some can even present in adult life. So this is something really important to recognize that though we say congenital from birth, it actually can present later in life as well. So what do CMS patients present with? So, and really the core symptom of what's called myasthenia is this fatigable weakness, muscle weakness. So what it means is when you do an activity using a muscle over and over again, the muscle tires. And depending on which muscle you use, you come with different symptoms. And the common symptoms that we see or signs is in the eyes. So patients present with droopy eyes, and they say the droopy eyes get worse as the day progresses, and that's called as ptosis. Or you might have an inability to move your eye muscles, which is what we call ophthalmoplegia, or weakness in the facial muscles. So they may not be able to close their mouth fully, chewing, or their smile is not as normal. Or it could be problems with their swallow. So patients might require support with feeding, whether that's through tube feeds, or sometimes they struggle with just managing their secretions. Or some patients might just have a nasal twang to their speech because the muscles which control the speech are not working effectively. And the most common is what we call weakness, so particularly affecting the limb muscles. So in children, they can present with delay in their motor ability. So delayed walking, even when they achieve walking, they struggle with running, things like that. Or in older children and adults, it's weakness on activity, and particularly those that involve the muscles around the hips and the shoulder in most CMS types. So those would be difficulty walking, running, going up and down stairs, difficulty with brushing hair, washing hair, so things like that might be what they present with. We do have some CMSs where patients do have weakness, particularly with hand grip. And the other area they might have weakness is neck. So keeping the neck up, that might get, they might struggle with that, particularly as the day progresses. And then finally is the breathing issues, and these can be life-threatening. So these could be when babies or children have sudden episodes where they stop breathing, they collapse, they might end up in ICU requiring breathing support, or they get chest infections, which require antibiotics quite frequently or admission to hospitals. And in some cases, the breathing muscles are quite severely affected that they might need breathing support during the day or at night time, whether through a mask or through a tracheostomy, which is needs to be performed. And depending on the CMS type, we've got patients with very mild, with some symptoms, with quite severe on the other end, who have, most of these symptoms. So it can really vary. And each types of CMS also can have slightly different presentations and nuances. So this is a busy picture, but this just is to highlight the 35 genes which are currently reported to cause CMS. I'm not going to talk about all of these genes, but this is just to give you a flavor of there are a lot of genes which do cause CMS. And we do divide them to those at the nerve terminal, what we call presynaptic CMS, then synaptic, so the space between the nerve and the muscle, and then postsynaptic, those which are on the muscle side. And these genes really are the most common ones that we see in our clinics, both in the UK and globally. So again, just to highlight this, so we classify the CMS into 3 types: presynaptic, synaptic, and postsynaptic. And I've just summarized here how the most common genes that we see in these subtypes. And as you can see here, the postsynaptic on the muscle end tends to be the most common genes that present with CMS. So again, going back to our cohort of patients here in Oxford, what are the common causes of CMS? I've just put them in a chart here, but what you can really see is the top 3 are the most common, and they account for 75% of our patients. The first one called ACHR deficiency, which is when the receptors, if you remember, you don't make enough receptors, and that's why the nerve muscle junction can't talk to each other. So that's the commonest. Then rhabdin and DOX7 were 2 proteins on the muscle side, which are quite important in bringing the receptors together. So these account for our common patients, most common patients in our clinics, but there are the other types as well, as I've highlighted. So moving on to, what does the current management of CMS involve? And first and foremost, it's the supportive care is really important. As I've showed you, patients who have difficulties with feeding would need, feeding support to make sure their nutrition's optimized. They're not at risk of aspirations, which can put them at chest infections and things. If they require breathing support, that's optimized. If patients require support with physio, OT, those are optimized. So that supportive care is really important part of CMS management. But what we really do have in CMS is that we do have drug treatments which can help our patients. It's important to recognize that these treatments are not cure. So they are treatments which improve function, but patients continue to still have CMS, which can vary from mild to moderate to severe degree despite current treatments. So what are the treatments that we use? So this is at the nerve muscle junction again. And what the commonest treatment what we use is called is to increase the chemical acetylcholine, which was the messenger between the nerve and the muscle junction. And there are 2 drugs which do that. So one is acetylcholinesterase inhibitor, which you can see on the left-hand side. So this is what's called pyridostigmine or mestinon. That's the commonest drug used. And what it does is it prevents the enzyme acetylcholinesterase, which normally takes the acetylcholine back to the nerve side, to not work, to pause it so that the acetylcholine stays at the nerve muscle junction for longer and it can act for longer. And the other is 3,4-diaminopyridine or 3,4-DAB, which works on the nerve side. You can see here on the top right-hand corner. And what it does is it causes the nerve to make more of these packets of acetylcholine, so more acetylcholine is released. The other group of drugs are what we call stabilizers of the nerve muscle junction. And these are groups called drugs called as beta-2 agonists, so sodium ephedrine and salbutamol. And they help to sort of realign the structure of the nerve muscle junction on the muscle side when it is not is as is not as the architecture has been lost because of the CMS. And finally, we've got another group of drugs which are very specifically used for a type of CMS called slow channel CMS, where the CMS, the acetylcholine receptor, is open for too long and they close this receptor, and they call as open channel blockers. And that's fluoxetine, commonly used, but we sometimes rarely use quinidine as well. So just talking about these drugs again. So when we think about presynaptic CMS, of which the one here on top chart is the most common one, what you have is you're not producing enough of the chemical, the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. So the drugs, what you need to use is to increase the amount of acetylcholine. So that will be your pyridostigmine and 3,4-DAP. Whereas the synaptic CMS, the most common is this gene called COL-Q, which you can see here in the middle. And the way it works is it makes the acetylcholine esterase, which is the enzyme, not work as effectively. So you already have too much acetylcholine because the enzyme is not working well. So actually, these patients, you should not give more of the pyridostigmine 3,4-DAP. We need to use a different type of drugs. And that is the beta-2 agonist, salbutamol and ephedrine. And then we've got the muscle side, these common genes, and in all of these, what happens is you don't have enough of the acetylcholine there, or the acetylcholine is there, but because of the problems at the muscle terminal, it's not working effectively. So your treatment would be to increase the amount of acetylcholine. Okay. And then we've got two what we call kinetic defects, where the receptor is there. There are receptors there, but the receptor, the way it opens and closes, is not as normal. So this could be what we call slow channel, where the receptor is open for too long, because in that case, you've got too much of the neurotransmitter already there. Or the fast channel, where it closes too quickly. Because it closes too quickly, there's not enough time for the message to come from the nerve to the muscle. So when it's slow channel, when it's open too long, we want to close it. And that's where we use the open channel blockers, the fluoxetine and quinidine. Whereas when it's fast channel, it's open for too short duration. You want to increase the number of acetylcholine so that as long as the channel is open, a lot of it can go across and cause the nerve muscle junction transmission to be effective. Okay. So where do we use what drug? And that really is really important to decide on treatments, particularly, as I'll say in a minute, that some drugs can make some types of CMS worse. So all of these in orange are CMS types where you don't make enough acetylcholine. Okay, so in that case, what you give is increase the acetylcholine, and the two medicines will be pyridostigmine and 3,4-DAP. But in those where there is too much acetylcholine already there, remember the COL-Q and the slow channel, you don't want to give more acetylcholine by giving the other two drugs I mentioned now, you could make things worse. So in these patients, we use salbutamol for the COL-Q, which was at the synaptic region. And for the slow channel, we close the channel quicker by fluoxetine or quinidine. Then we have another group of drugs which I talked about, which are the beta-2 agonists. And they are really important because there's a process where the receptors, they are quite neatly packaged next to each other. And this is really important for the message to come across effectively. Because if these receptors are further away, what we call a dispersion, then the message does not come effectively. And in some genetic CMSs like DOX7, MuSK, or some other CMSs like ACHR deficiency as well on high-dose pyridostigmine, the receptors go further away. And the further away they go, the nerve-muscle junction architecture is lost. And in these patients, what we do is actually, they would worsen further with pyridostigmine because you're making those receptors go further and further away. And they are treated with salbutamol and ephedrine because it helps to regain that architecture at the nerve muscle junction, which has been lost. So these are very specific for these patients. Okay. And just to add here, there are some patients, what we call ACHR deficiency, which is the cohort here, where we do use salbutamol ephedrine when they have been on pyridostigmine for a long time, because high dose of pyridostigmine also can cause these nerve muscle junction architecture to be lost, and also in some fast channels. Finally, I just want to sort of end by saying, we've got the treatments that we currently have, but actually there is an unmet need in our patients because, a proportion of them do still have moderate to severe weakness, which is not averted by our current treatments. So there's lots of research going on to find more specific disease-modifying treatments in CMS, which Dr. Dong will talk about in the next talk. But I just want to mention this specific study because this is actually the first randomized controlled trial in CMS with a specific disease-modifying treatment. And this is for a very particular type of CMS, what we call DOX7 CMS. This study, which actually has just completed recruitment and the data lock was only yesterday, was a double-blind placebo-controlled trial in adult participants about 18 years. And it was looking at this compound called Arginex 119. And this compound works at this region here. If you see at the bottom right-hand corner, this LRP4 MuSK DOX7. So that is a sort of a package that comes together to get the receptors to come together in clustering. So when patients have DOX7 CMS, this mechanism does not work as well. So the receptors are further away and the nerve muscle junction transmission doesn't work effectively. So the way this compound is proposed to work is it goes and works on the MuSK, which is part of the same package. So it can bypass that DOX7 defect and cause that clustering to come together. We've just, like I said, just completed the initial part of the study, and we hope the company hopefully will share the results in the next 3 to 4 months. And if it does look, the initial study has positive results, but also has good data on safety, there's likely going to be further phase 3 studies for DOX7 CMS. And because of the mechanism in which this drug works, it won't just be for DOX7 CMS, it could also be used for other CMSs like Agrin, LRP4, which are in the same pathway. Okay. So in summary, I hope I've just given a brief overview of that CMS is a treatable condition, but it's important to recognize the different types of CMSs because the treatments will differ depending on what type of CMS a patient has. In particular, some CMS treatments can make some CMS subtypes worse. We do have treatments, but actually we do have patients who have a significant unmet need. And that's why we've got ongoing research that really is to identify more effective disease-modifying treatments to help patients with CMS. I'd just like to finish by thanking the lovely team I work in Oxford and also always our patients and families. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sitara. That was a really good talk and really interesting to see how all of the different drugs work and why it's so important to kind of make sure that we're getting the right treatments to the different patients. So if you do have any questions, do pop them in the Q&A chat. We're going to move on to the next talk from Dr. Yin Dong, but we'll answer any questions that you have at the end of this session. So moving over to our next speaker, Dr. Yin Dong. He's the head of neurosciences group at the Weatherall Institute of Molecular Medicine and is investigating potential new treatments for CMS, including some research that is funded by MD UK. So I'll let you discuss some of the latest research from the lab. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Can you hear me? Okay, I'm just going to share my slides. Okay, can you see my slides?
They're just coming.
Okay.
Yeah, all good. Thank you.
Right. So yeah, as Dr. Roy just said, I'm just going to share some very up-to-date treatments on what is in the pipeline, in the preclinical. So bearing in mind, none of these are being tested in patients. All the data I'm showing are in mice, with one exception. So just to disclose, our group has received funding from Amplo Biotechnology and Arginex, which is 2 out of the 3 companies that's work I'll be talking about today. Just to give you an introduction, I'm going to be talking about some gene therapies that's been developed by Amplo Biotechnology. some very recent data, and I won't show the data itself because it's unpublished, on the MuSK agonist antibodies that Dr. Ramdas just talked about in a different subtype of CMS called Agrin CMS. And I also talk about a new treatment that's currently being has previously been tested in myasthenia gravis, so the autoimmune form of myasthenia, and that's also they are going to try and test into congenital forms of myasthenia in the near future. Just to give you a reminder of some of the genes that I'll be talking about in this talk. So as Dr. Randolph said, the neuromuscular junction works by transmitting the signal from the nerve in these little pockets that I'm showing here as acetylcholine, which hit these acetylcholine receptors, which need to be clustered on the postsynaptic membrane, which then starts the electrical signal that passes along your muscle. So you need the signal to be synthesized. And one of the enzymes that's really important in doing that is called CHAT, which is also the most common form of presynaptic CMS. You then needs to be transmitted to the receptors, which need to be clustered. And the clustering occurs via the mechanism where an agrin signal is released by the nerve. It hits the LRP4 and MuSK complex, which the signal is further transmitted by the DOX7 protein. So just remember that there's this complex of proteins called agrin, MuSK, LRP4, and DOX7 that's important for the clustering of the receptor. And on top of that, you have a CoQ molecule that sticks to it, and which also binds the choline esterase molecules that breaks down and recycles the acetylcholine that goes back in. So you've got CHAT that is important in the making of the signal. You've got the receptors that are responsible for detecting the signal that needs to be clustered by this big complex of proteins, which then initiates an electrical signal across the membrane. And I'm afraid all of that will be relevant to the talks, the treatments that I'm about to talk about. So first, I'm going to give you a refresher on how adeno-associated viral gene therapies works. So this is the most common method of delivering gene therapies that you've heard about for microdystrophins, muscular dystrophy, as well as spinal muscular atrophies that's both been very successful and used in the clinic right now. So there are little viruses that have basically been altered so that they can't divide inside your bodies. And this has been well established, so it is safe that these viruses will not make themselves inside of your bodies. And then what we do is we put our gene of interest inside of this so that it is a vector. It carries our gene of interest, so the gene that is faulty in the patients, and that then crosses into the cell, into your nucleus, and it releases the gene of interest, so the gene that we want to replace the faulty gene, which then sits next to your own gene, so it usually doesn't integrate into your own genome. That then produces the messenger molecules, RNA, which in turn gets produced into protein. So essentially, how gene therapies work is you're packaging your faulty gene, a correct copy of your faulty gene, and places it where it needs to go so that it can produce a non-faulty gene. So that's normally called a gene replacement therapy. So we tested a gene replacement for the DOX7 gene, which, if you remember, is really important in clustering the acetylcholine receptors together. And we can show in a recent data that we published early this year that this gene therapy at a moderate dose. And so one of the things that's important to remember about gene therapies is, as with all drugs, dose is very important. At high doses, it can have toxic effects, but at moderate doses, it can be therapeutic and not have such a risk for toxic effects. So we showed that at an intermediary dose of 6 × 10^13 viral genomes per kilo, we can rescue these very severe models, and so that they can have normal lifespans once the treatment works. We also showed that in these mice, at the intermediary dose, as well as the higher dose we tested, we made the mice at least as strong as the wild type mice. So this is a normal mouse that was treated with saline, which is basically the placebo in our experiment, and we made the mice at least as strong in both the male mice and the female mice. So the current state of this treatment, this is probably the most advanced stage of all the gene therapies right now, is the company has completed toxicology studies, part of which we published in our paper. And also they're now analyzing biodistribution data to make sure that the treatment reaches most, if not all, of the muscles in our bodies. The next treatment that has been developed is for the replacement of the CoQ. So CoQ is a collagen molecule that's bound to the complex that I mentioned, and then it is important in localizing the choline esterase that breaks down and terminates the signal. So if you have too much signal, as you would like in slow channel, that's also bad. So in CoQ patients, as Dr. Ramdas mentioned, patients have too much signal. So because the acetylcholine is not being broken down fast enough. And so in this treatment, we placed a gene for CoQ inside of the virus. And then this was done work by Dr. Ono over 10 years ago now. And they showed that in these mice, and this is a running test to see how long the mice can stay running on the wheel for. And at a relatively high dose, the mice were able to run as much and as far as long as the wild type mice, normal mice. And the electrical signal testing, which a lot of the CMS patients would have done, where they're seeing how well your nerves communicate with your muscles, we can also see that in the mice, the untreated mice like this, they have a big decrement in their signal, but this is much improved once they've received the gene therapy. And so more recent study has just been completed, and where they did a dose escalation to try and find what dose this gene therapy works at. And that is soon to be published. And the last gene therapy I want to talk about that has been recently developed. It was only published last year. This is to replace the CHAT gene. So if you remember, CHAT is the gene that's really important in producing the acetylcholine signal. And so in these mice, when they induce the CHAT deficiency, the mice die very quickly. But when they give the AAV gene therapy, you can see that you have much more of them survive. And the ones that do survive, they live for nearly normal lifespans. Most of them live a normal lifespan. And we can see also in a running test that, again, the ones that have the CHAT deficiency, they are much worse than the wild type, the normal mice. But if you give them the gene therapy, they're running much further, and they can run about the same as the wild type mice. Similarly, in the electrical signaling, in the normal mice, you can see that you have a flat signal across. When you have the CHAT deficient mice, the signal starts to reduce, which is what doctors will call decrement. And see, you have a reduced efficiency of transmission between the nerve and the muscle. But once they have given the gene therapy, the signal becomes normal again, very close to normal. Next, I'm going to talk about MuSK agonist antibodies. And just a reminder, the antibody is thought to cross-link and bring the two MuSK molecules together, mimicking what DOX7 does. And this is why it's effective at treating DOX7 CMS. And but agrin, as I showed earlier, is the signal that initiates this complex, and that would come from the nerve. And so effectively, this is downstream of that signaling mechanism. And recent unpublished work that was presented at the World Muscle Congress last year by Hans Lochmüller's lab showed that the musk agonist antibody, also showed a promising effectiveness in their mouse model of agrin deficiency in mice. So we think this treatment may also be useful to patients with deficiencies in agrin function. So lastly, I'm going to talk to you about the chloride channel inhibitors. And here I'm going to give a refresher on how the electrical signaling of the muscle works. So chloride channels are very important in maintaining your resting membrane potential. So all of our cells have a resting electrical potential. So that means they're set at -70 millivolts. And the way that your nerves and your cells would work when you activate that to trigger the electrical signal or the depolarization across your muscles, which is what makes your muscles twitch and contract, is that they send the electrical signal, and that's what your acetylcholine receptors are doing. They let in sodium and potassium ions into your muscles, which then causes the voltage-gated sodium ion channels to open all along your muscles. The chloride ions are important, channels are important in setting this resting potential. So normally this is produced, the initial stimulus is produced by the acetylcholine receptors, which then triggers this depolarization by the sodium channels, and then it's reset by potassium channels and chloride channels. So what the chloride channel inhibitors do is they increase the resting potential. So that makes it much easier for the cells to become depolarized. Now, the inhibitor they're using is very specific to the CLIC1 chloride channel, which is only expressed on your skeletal muscles. And it raises this resting potential and allows it to make it easier. So all the patients who are not producing enough of an acetylcholine signal, the acetylcholine receptors don't need to work so hard to trigger that initial stimulus. And so they showed in a mouse model of myasthenia gravis, in compared to a vehicle, which is the placebo treatment, or the existing treatment, which is pyridostigmine, they showed that the chloride inhibitors had a significant improvement on both the vehicle and the pyridostigmine. And you can see that it has a compound effect with the pyridostigmine, which is what we'd expect, because the pyridostigmine increases the longevity of the acetylcholine in the neuromuscular junction and therefore would boost the strength of the signal. And that's what's the most exciting part of the chloride inhibitor, is that they should have an additive effect to existing treatments for CMS. And so they also showed that they have, in terms of strength, these mice was also stronger. It made them significantly stronger than the placebo-treated mice. And they even tested this in some myasthenia gravis patients where they found their treatment had only mild side effects, and they had modest but significant improvements to myasthenia gravis patients after 3 or 5 hours. And half the patients reported a clinically significant improvement. So bearing in mind, myasthenia gravis is caused by antibodies, which this treatment does not affect at all, whereas it affects the signaling pathway. That's why we think it is potentially useful in congenital myasthenia, where there are no antibodies. So just to summarize, there are promising preclinical data for AAV-based gene therapies for DOX7, CoQ, and CHAT congenital myasthenic syndromes, and the musk agonist antibody treatment that is currently in clinical trials for DOX7 CMS also holds promise for agrin CMS as well. And there are new treatment called CLIC1 inhibitors that have shown promise in current models of myasthenia gravis. And we think that there are an exciting prospective treatment for congenital forms of myasthenia as well. And they are currently in discussions with groups around the world for testing their treatment in models of congenital myasthenia. And I just want to highlight the companies that are developing these treatments. So Amplo Biotechnology is developing the gene therapies, Algenex is developing the muscle agonist antibodies, and NMD Pharma is developing the chloride channel inhibitors. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting and great to see that there are so many different treatments that are kind of being investigated at the moment and hopefully being taken forward to further research as well. So we do have a couple of questions, but I'm just going to kick off with one. What do you think is the most challenging part of being able to find these treatments and develop these treatments for congenital myasthenia syndrome?
I think the most challenging part is probably finding. I'm afraid I'm going to give you a sad answer, and the reality is the economics of it is that, you know, a lot of the treatments, the new treatments, there are development costs, there are costs for the company. So to an extent, it's going to be dependent on the number of patients that these treatments work on to make it whether it's viable economically for a company to develop these treatments. And so we're always trying to work with the companies to make sure these treatments not only work on the patients and the models, but also that they also are viable to develop. And I think the other difficulty always for any treatment is the translation between the model. You know, the mice are not humans, right? All of the data I'm showing you, nearly all of it, except the chloride channel data in the myasthenia gravis patients, was done on, you know, rodent models. So rodent models aren't people. They don't necessarily give you the best estimate. And so there is always a risk that a treatment doesn't necessarily translate, and that's always a difficulty. But unfortunately, this is why we do these experiments. And some of the rarer subtypes of myasthenia, it can be a bit more tricky. But hopefully, some of these treatments that we're most excited about, such as the AAV-based treatments, people are trying to test kind of a one-size-fits-all strategy for developing gene therapy, so that even those patients where there are like one or two in the world, if we have a good and safe delivery mechanism, that we can say, okay, even for the super rare patients, we can still develop a treatment for you. And other treatments like the chloride channel inhibitors that are likely to work for multiple subtypes, therefore it then matters less whether a patient has a super rare subtype of the disease, and then it potentially could still work for them. And I think that's the difficulty of rare diseases as a whole, right? When you have only a tiny proportion where there are enough of them for a single treatment to be a viable, you know, in a development pathway. But then if we can create these treatments that can be useful for multiple subtypes, then that suddenly makes it much more tractable for developing these treatments for both the scientists, the industries, as well as the patients.
Definitely. And I think, you know, finding treatments that can work across multiple different pathways and conditions is so important, and that's why that research into really understanding what's happening within these conditions is so important, to see, okay, this mechanism happens within these conditions as well, making it okay, we could use this for many different conditions. And some people may have seen last week, I think it was, in the news, that there was reports of personalized gene treatment where someone over in America had received treatment that was personalized specifically for them. So it's exciting to start to see that approach coming more and more forward, and hopefully with further research that will be really exciting. Someone has mentioned that this is all really exciting, but they're starting to wonder when we're thinking this might start to move towards clinical trials and being tested in people as well. Obviously, we know one of them is being tested at the moment, and we know research takes a long time, but just kind of thoughts around that as well.
So I know that the DOC7 AAV treatment, which is kind of furthest along the gene therapy pathways, is quite close. I think within the next couple of years, if the company can secure some investment in doing the clinical trials, I think that's kind of the time frame. Within maybe the next 2 or 3 years, it might enter clinical trials. The other gene therapies, I think, maybe a bit further down the line. I think for the MuSK agonist antibodies, in terms of in Agrin patients necessarily, I think it's up to the company whether they want to extend their current clinical trials on DOC7 to whether they want to include that to extend it into Agrin patients. And to the extent that may dependent on how effective it looks in the DOC7 patients, for them to do their little calculations on what works for them, what doesn't. The chloride channel inhibitors, it's hard to say, obviously, because we haven't even started preclinical testing in congenital myasthenia. But yeah, I think there is a recognized need for speeding these things up by the regulators and everyone who works in these things. So hopefully these things are a bit faster and more efficient than days gone by. So hopefully, and I hate to give timelines on these things, but with a good tailwind, right? Maybe 5 to 10 years in clinical trials, assuming all the data is positive, of course.
Of course, yes. Thank you. Yeah, no, I appreciate it's really difficult to give timelines on these kinds of things, and there's a lot of research that has to go into to make sure that they're safe enough and they show enough potential to go into clinical trials as well. We've also had someone ask, why might someone have moderate symptoms of CMS when they only have one bad copy of the gene? And they've mentioned the CoQ gene here.
Okay, shall I answer that? So first, with CoQ, it's unlikely with one copy you've got CMS. CoQ is a condition where you should have defect in both copies of the CMS gene. So I mean, just as a general listing. So that's one thing. Second, we know with all CMS patients, they're not all the same. So we have example when in CoQ, we've got some who are very severe, start as babies, very this thing, but some who are much more milder symptoms. And that variation, we cannot fully predict just based on the genetic test per se. And we recognize that for a lot of our CMS patients that you can have, even within siblings, there's variation. One sibling is more severe than the other. So there are other factors, just, not just, not producing enough protein or how the membranes are working or the channels working. There are other factors which contributes to why the severity varies between patients. So it's not just, you can't based just on the genetic defect itself to predict accurately in all cases. In some we can, but not in all cases. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you.
Sorry,
carry on.
Sorry, that genetic testing is quite a complex thing because now we recognize genes, not just like one little sequence that you just read the whole thing and that's it. The gene is split into lots of little chunks. There's lots of parts of the gene that's not traditionally considered what goes into the protein. And so to do a full genetic testing of a gene is a very complex procedure, and therefore even our group, sometimes you can very difficult to pick up the second variant. And so there are a lot of technical challenges to finding a second variant, and it can take a lot of effort to sequence like megabases of the whole gene locon. And so it's not necessary that you only have one variant, it's just no one's found another variant. If that makes sense. They've only found one variant in the patient.
Yeah, I was about to ask if there are any challenges with genetic testing itself. Obviously, like there's, our genes are huge and there's lots of going on there.
Exactly. So it could be like in an enhancer region, a promoter region, untranslated region, an intronic region that often is not covered by most genetic testing. And so sometimes if you're sure someone is myasthenic or that you can spend ages trying to sequence the whole thing in great details. And some sequences are very, very hard to sequence. Although we say the whole human genome has been sequenced, actually there are dark spots of the genome we can't sequence because it's just too technically challenging.
Fascinating. And do you think we found most of the genes that are involved in myasthenia syndromes, or do you think there are still some that are yet to be discovered?
That's a very difficult question. Certainly in terms of speed of new gene discovery, it hasn't been as You know, was lots of new genes discovered in the about 10 years ago, and to 20 to 10 years ago, when all the next generation sequencing or the whole genome, whole exome sequencing came online. And certainly the rate of discovery of new genes has slowed down a bit. So, and the ones that have discovered are generally for rarer cases. So it's always hard to say whether you have discovered most of something, but certainly in terms of publication wise, there's certainly fewer and fewer new genes being published. So fingers crossed we have found most of them, but you can never tell.
I was just going to add, just looking at our cohort of patients, where who've been referred with suspected myasthenia, and clinically we feel they have a congenital myasthenic syndrome. Less than 5% are ones we don't have a genetic cause. So we do think, it's a very small proportion. And I think what's really important, which, we didn't have the time to go through in my talk, is while there is those genes which are typical, CMS is the main picture. They come with myasthenic and distinct weakness. What we have realized in the last 5 years is there are lots of genes have been identified where they have more of a multi-system presentation, and like other systems affected, brain, kidneys, gut, this thing, where the nerve muscle junction problem is part of a whole picture. So they're not pure CMS, and that's really important when we think about CMS treatments and research, that a treatment which is specific for the nerve muscle junction is not going to sort out the problems elsewhere. And I think that's where we probably will see lots more genes, is where the new genes, where the CMS or the myasthenic problem is part of a more multi-system picture with the newer genetic testing rather than pure CMS.
Brilliant, thank you. And there's a couple in the chat just talking about differences in change in diagnosis. They're saying that they may be positive for the can't even pronounce it, of the receptor, but then it may change to like a slow channel with genetic testing. Are there ways that it both can be involved and all can be involved as one?
I think the first thing is going back to the clinical picture, how a patient's symptoms and history presents. It's unusual in our experience to have both. One is an antibody-mediated process, one is a genetic, and it's going back to both, where was the antibody testing done? Was it at, because we do know with the antibody testing, particularly antibody testing that is done on ELISA can be what we call false positive. So, accurately test that would be important. And then obviously with the genetic testing as well, we do find variants, which are variants of what we call unknown significance. So is it a clear report variant? So there would be nuances there that you need a clinician, a geneticist to look in more details. Actually, does the clinical picture fit with an antibody-mediated myasthenia or myasthenia gravis or a genetic myasthenia? And particularly, you mentioned slow channel. Slow channel has a very typical clinical picture of where the muscle pattern of weakness is involved, which is not seen in myasthenia gravis. So there would be sort of nuances there which need to be looked into in detail. But unusual in our case that in our experience that you have both types of myasthenia, the genetic and the acquired form.
Brilliant, thank you. Fascinating. It's obviously quite a complex condition, and Dr. Dong, when you were going through that first kind of picture of all the different pathways and proteins involved, it definitely shows that it's complex, but we appreciate all of the research and the work that you're doing to help us understand it and find treatments. So with that, I'm going to bring, in the interest of time, bring the research section to a close, and a big thank you to both Dr. Dong and Dr. Ramdas for your presentations this morning. And I will pass back over to Jackie to chair the Living Well section.
Thanks, Charlotte. Yep, so Charlotte's mentioned we'll now move on to discuss living with congenital myasthenic syndromes. So I mentioned at the beginning, I'm Jackie Monroe and I'm Head of Regional Support Outreach and Information at Muscular Dystrophy UK. So really delighted to welcome our 5 panellists today who'll be joining Dr. Dong and Dr. Ramdas and will help us to discuss and answer your questions. So we're being joined today by Dr. Leanne Henan, Dr. Phil Davies, Hayley Ramjatan, Katie Nevin and Tracy Maitland. So I'll invite each of them to make a few remarks about their experience of congenital myasthenic syndromes and to raise some key points about managing or living with the condition. So I'd mentioned at the beginning of the seminar, we'll be covering as many questions as we can that have been submitted in advance. We'll also be using the Q&A function, which you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen. Please type your question or comment and we'll feed them into discussion. I'd mentioned earlier as well that any questions we don't manage to cover or that we don't know the answers to, we'll seek to answer directly after the seminar. So if I can, Dr. Henahan, can I come to you first, just to kind of introduce yourself in relation to CMS and explain a bit about your role?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, can, yes.
Okay. So I'm sick today, so I'm a bit croaky. But hello, everyone. I think I will have met most people in clinic. You'll all know me. I've been here for 2 years. I'm a adult neurologist, and I qualified in Australia, and then I moved here to do some work with Jackie and Satara before I eventually moved back to Ireland. This has actually been my first kind of job in neuromuscular. Previously, I specialized in multiple sclerosis. So this has been a real learning curve for me as well, but it's, so interesting. It's taken me a couple of years to understand things fully. So I can only imagine how difficult it is for patients to get, a good grasp on things. But it seems like I've joined the team at a really exciting time where, we finally now have, some gene therapies, and there's a lot moving forward. Sorry. I'll just get some water.
No problem at all.
Okay, so I'm feeling a bit better. I've, as I said, I've learned a lot about the neuromuscular junction and the kind of nuances between the different types of CMS and the reasons that you would use different treatments. We've had our patient day recently, which I think a lot of people will have attended. And over the last few years, I've tried to cover the basics of the different types of CMS, and also went through all of the treatments recently in another presentation. So hopefully, most of our patients understand why they're on their drugs, and kind of understand where their CMS fits into the bigger picture. I think that's me.
Thanks so much, Dr. Henahan. I'm sorry to hear you're not feeling well today.
That's okay. I have a small child comes with the territory.
Thank you. Hayley, could I move on to you next? Introduce yourself, please.
Sure. Hi, I'm Hayley. I'm a neuromuscular physio in Oxford. I work in pediatrics, doing lots of neuromuscular conditions, and I've had the pleasure of working in the congenital myasthenic team for 12 years now. So I see lots of patients, and I am the annoying person who does all of the assessments with you and will make you tired, and everyone moans and groans with. So I am particularly interested in the outcome measures that we use for CMS, and the kind of the functional impact that maybe even some of the new drugs we're trying has on our patients. So yeah, that's me. Thanks very much, Hayley. Dr. Davies, could I come to you next, please?
Yeah, sure. I'm Dr. Phil Davis. I'm a respiratory paediatrician up in Glasgow. So I look after a lot of the children with neuromuscular disease from particularly the west of Scotland, but actually we pull in from quite a lot of all of Scotland, really. I've got particular interests in sleep medicine and in ventilation. And so I look after a lot of children who are on both non-invasive and also invasive tracheostomy ventilation. And we work as part of a national network up here in Scotland, which basically pulls people together, and we monitor children with all sorts of different neuromuscular conditions here, with various forms of different sleep studies and lung function tests as part of the network that we have here.
That's great, thank you so much. And I'll just come to Tracy, who's joined us from myAware today. Tracy, are you happy to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, good morning, everybody. As Jackie said, my name's Tracy. I'm from the charity myAware. So we look after those people diagnosed with CMS and their families, along with those with any of the myasthenias. CMS is not something that we have a huge amount of understanding of. And actually, we learn a lot from our members when we're talking to them, and we meet with on Zooms and things like that. So we always find when we're attending either the CMS days or things like this that, as a charity, we learn from the specialists. So it's always fascinating to come to these things. But yeah, it's lovely to see some of our members' names in the chat there. So yeah, thrilled to be invited and learn a little bit more today. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Tracy. It's lovely to have you here. And finally, I'll just come to Katie.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me today. So I'm Katie Nevin. I'm an adult specialist neuromuscular physio, and I'm with the team up in Sheffield with Dr. Channa Humanduma. So my involvement more is with all types of neuromuscular conditions, but we also see patients with myasthenia gravis and congenital myasthenia. I am more focused on my adult kind of living healthily with their conditions, trying to help them get into work or access their school, college, and kind of support them around that, and also helping them exercise potentially with their condition. So how to safely exercise or keep fit and healthy, how to kind of know their boundaries and limitations. So that's where I kind of focus more of my attention with our adult patients with myasthenia gravis.
Thank you very
and
much.
Congenital myasthenia.
Thanks a lot. So we do have some questions, and there's a couple of questions in the chat as well. So I'll just move on to them, and then anyone who feels that they can answer, please just come in. So we did have a question submitted in advance this morning with someone asking, how does DOX7 affect the heart, and what is the correlation between coronary artery disease and DOX7?
Do you want me to go on that? As far as we are aware, DOX7 does not affect the heart or coronary heart disease related to myasthenia or any types of myasthenia. So the coronary artery disease, if an individual has, would be related to normal age and other sort of coronary artery health risk factors. So CMS is not associated with increased risk of heart problems or particularly coronary heart disease.
Okay, thank you very much for answering that.
Can I pop in? I think there may have been, it might be a bit of confusion because the patients will know that I'm looking through all of the charts, the whole cohort, and early on in DOX7, I think that there was a couple of case reports published about people with DOX7 who also had cardiomyopathy, and I think one of them maybe had a valve problem. So then they did early on, they started doing echoes on everyone who had DOX7 to see if they could find a trend, and they didn't. So I think they were one-offs, and maybe that's what's led to that kind of confusion. So there is some early literature, I think, out there, but that's been disproven.
Thank you very much. So Tracy, this might be one for you to answer. Someone's asked in the chat, as someone who lives way up north and can't access patient days or come to Oxford very easily, is there a way that they can access support, advice and help?
Yeah, certainly. As a charity, we nationally now look after anybody with any of the myasthenias. So specifically for those with CMS, we have a Facebook group. So that is for CMS members only, so they can kind of connect with each other and support each other and kind of share information that they have. We also run specialist Zooms. They are bi-monthly. So again, it's all for those with CMS, and we often see some of the members that are here today. So we have quite an international session when it's for those with CMS. So anybody that has access to the internet and is able to use the computer to join us on Zoom, and obviously they can join via the phone as well if that's easier for them. So we do have specific things for those with CMS, and recently we did some a session with Sitara and Hayley. So we do have specific things for people with CMS, but we also can do one-to-one support as well. So yeah, it doesn't matter where you are in the country, you can access support from anywhere.
Thanks, Tracy. And I wonder, just from a clinical perspective, if people find it difficult to travel, are there things that are put in place to support with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to say that. So yeah, so we do offer virtual appointments to our patients. It's always good to at least, because CMS, a lot of it is muscle weakness, to examine them. So we do see patients, see them face to face every 2 years, but have virtual in between. So that is something we can facilitate. We do some outreach clinics up north, so it would be worth discussing with your local neurologist, and they can contact us, and we can obviously, see them jointly if it's a clinic that we do outreach clinics, or certainly we can see them once in Oxford and then offer virtual appointments with infrequent travels to Oxford. But yeah.
Thank you very much. So just another couple of questions in the chat. So someone's asked in the chat, and I might get this pronunciation wrong, but I understand it differs from patient to patient, but how much pyridoxysteamine and 3,4-DAP is safe to use per day for adult patients?
So again, it depends on your type of CMS that you have and what this thing you do. So we tend, for an adult patient, we normally wouldn't go, we might go between 360 milligrams or, sometimes maybe not higher than that generally. And obviously it's how you tolerate with your side effects as well. And with 3,4-DAP, we may not go over 60 milligrams total dose in a day. So total dose in a day generally, yeah.
Thanks, Dr. Ramdas. Dr. Davies, this is, I think, likely one for yourself. So someone has asked, how are respiratory problems monitored in CMS, and how would a respiratory crisis generally be managed in children, and would the management of this be different in adults?
I'm a paediatrician, so I can comment on the child side of things. So again, the part of the issue, of course, with this set of conditions is they are so very variable, aren't they? So some of them will basically sort of be really very mild, and actually many children don't get significant respiratory problems or relatively mild ones at least, whilst others may present really very early on with more dramatic sets of symptoms. And again, there's two sort of main sides to this, really. There's like an emergency side of things where there are certain conditions and certain children who can have sudden events, and then there are other people who are just more chronically weak. And again, how you manage those, and there's obviously a correlation between some of those. So some of that is based around clinical history and in terms of how people are presenting. And if there is a clinical history around sudden events and sudden collapse, then there are very low thresholds, for example, for getting people seen and often being known to the local hospital so they know to present quickly and soon at the signs of any precipitating or concerning issues. Training families in life support, even for some very small children, again, may be very relevant, and knowing to act as they soon. If you are looking and monitoring for things, then areas that are often monitored are sleep studies. We all slightly breathe less at nighttime and during sleep. And so at those occasions, then more subtle signs of weakness can start showing themselves up. Those can be done with more detailed sleep studies, or even measures of oxygen and carbon dioxide in particular can be important. And there are some children who, if there's concern around the nature of the sleep, or particularly if they were having sudden events, then I suppose this could also be used, but that'd be quite unusual, to use things like mass ventilation and so on. If people are having very dangerous and frequent crises, then other conversations would need to happen around things like whether tracheostomy ventilation, people got themselves stuck on intensive care, for example. But again, this is a very unusual setup. So you sort of monitor in terms of the clinical symptoms for that, in terms of sudden events. The other thing to think about are other risk factors. So, for example, if somebody is having problems with for example, recurrent respiratory infections because of weakness, not being able to cough well and to be able to clear secretions. And again, things like chest physiotherapy and things to be able to clear secretions may be relevant. You have to monitor out also for things like safety of swallow. And again, if people are aspirating and food going down the wrong way, again, all those are risk factors that might need to be carefully managed, either in terms of a plan, particularly if people tire with feeding, or using things like nasogastric tubes and things if necessary. People don't have a safe swallow, and how that might be managed as well. So it's about trying to predict risk, to sort of treat early with chest infections, to come into hospital soon, if people start to tire. Again, if you are having a respiratory illness, you're more likely to tire and again have problems. So it's about using sort of the individual child's history to know what their own personal risk factors are, and looking out for more general risk factors that might cause people problems. Again, as people get older, you can do blowing tests and things to get a sense about strength. But again, the trouble is that can change again with fatigability. So there can be sudden collapses later on. But so in terms of monitoring, sleep study is probably the most useful thing alongside the clinical history. What people do in adults, they'll need to comment for other adult physicians on the call.
Thanks, Dr. Davies. Does any of the panel able to kind of comment in relation to adults and how kind of respiratory crisis or respiratory issues might be managed?
Yeah, I can comment. So as Dr. Davies said, it's kind of divided into acute and chronic. So often the pediatricians will see a lot more of the kind of more acute, like Rabson's. The children will have sudden apneas, but they'll be fine in between. You know, they'll have sudden respiratory crisis, but they'll be fine in between. Whereas what we found with some of the adults, particularly the Doc 7s and Col Qs, that they kind of tend to slowly decline over time, which is why we asked to have, you know, biannual sleep studies so we can keep an eye on things. And if you're slowly declining over time, and you know, then if you have an extra insult on top of that, so if you have a nasty pneumonia or something like that, or even an anesthetic, if you weren't aware that you had CMS, well, then that will tip you over into a crisis, and then you'll end up going to ICU and needed to be intubated and ventilated. And you know, some of our patients who didn't even know they had DOC7, that's how we found out that they had it, because they ended up in ICU having slowly declined and then getting a flu or something. Adults don't tend to have as many of the kind of acute crises as the children do. But then again, some people have had them post-anesthetic and just kind of random every now and again. But it would be usually more of a chronic thing that we would follow with the sleep studies and then put people on BiPAP if they need it to prevent going into a crisis.
Thank you both very much for answering that. Hayley and Katie, this might be one for you. So we've actually had 2 questions. So someone has asked, why is physiotherapy important for managing CMS or living well with CMS? But someone else has also asked that they understand that movement and activity can potentially make fatigue and muscle weakness worse in CMS. So in this case, what is the advice that you would give around things like exercise, stretching, and just trying to be more active in general?
I don't know if Katie, do you want me to go first?
Yeah, do you want to do kids first and then I'll do adults?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. Why is physio important? I mean, you know, we do lots of things as a physio in the clinic. So we will, one, help out with a lot of the assessments, a lot of the outcome measures to be able to plot change and see it over time. So that's just from an objective point of view. But the question around movement and activity was definitely something when I joined the team over a decade ago, was definitely a narrative that was kind of coming through that exercise is bad for myasthenia and it makes your myasthenia worse and you shouldn't do it. And actually the evidence doesn't really support that. Actually, you can very much do graded exercise safely, and it has a very positive impact on your CMS, on your function. Without sort of stepping on Katie's toes around adults, because I kind of do a little bit of both. Peds is tricky. It's really hard to pace and grade activities in children. They either can or they can't, and they often will. And they do kind of get this slightly boom bust kind of scenario with helicopter parenting and teachers trying to sort of slow them down. That just comes with age. I think we have to have sensible guidelines around the adults not pushing them to do PE when they can't do it, ensuring that we do put rest breaks in. One of the things that I often talk about is teaching people to understand their own signs and symptoms of fatigue. So, you know, if the child looks like their ptosis is a bit worse or they generally look more fatigued, that's almost your own internal sort of dialogue that I need to slow down. I need to kind of take breaks. So we do give advice to school around things like positioning in classrooms and how to modify PE. But for all the other reasons around supporting other comorbidities, why it's important to exercise, those are absolute reasons why we should exercise and why doing activity is really important. Katie, I don't know if you want to chip in and
Yeah, totally agree with Hayley. So, you know, generally I try and encourage most of my patients with any sort of neuromuscular condition to be, you know, active, and don't get confused with what an activity is and what exercise is, whether it's walking around the house, whether it's gardening, whether it's going into the kitchen and getting some food made. You don't have to be kind of going to a gym or getting into a swimming pool to class that as exercise. Activity and exercise are interlinked, and even just walking down to the shops to collect your morning paper is still counting as kind of keeping yourself healthy and moving. It's really important for people to maintain that activity level and keep themselves fit and healthy, because we know activity helps with all the other kind of problems that we might have as we get older. So heart disease, diabetes, increased weight, you know, it can help our mood and our sleep improve. And just because you have a condition doesn't mean that we can't kind of tailor some activity and exercise to you. So it's important for that. With my adults with CMS, I definitely encourage them. They must be stable. So if they're wanting to do kind of higher level activities such as the gym or getting into a swimming pool, making sure they're really stable on their medication, that they're not going into kind of crisis or dipping or getting those really severe fatigue or ptosis where their eyes are drooping. So making sure they're noting that and they're on a stable medicine regime. And then if they have been stable, you know, helping them support kind of access higher level stuff if that's what they want to do. So going into the gym, making sure they're not pushing themselves too hard, really noticing fatigue and tiredness, but also using kind of breathing, something what we call the Borg scale, so like a breathlessness scale, to notice how far they're pushing themselves. So ideally it goes from 0 to 10, so 10 being really high. That breathlessness scale, you know, you're gasping, you're on the floor. We don't want to get to those levels, but we want to work around middle of 5 or 6. So, you know, we can move or walk or use a bike. But we can also talk, and we'd be able to, you know, sing if we had to, maybe not in the gym, but we could talk and we're not so out of breath. So noticing those levels. I have lots of conversations with my patients about if they are really fatigued and they're still trying to fit in some higher level activity, of when is it worth it? If you're going to a gym or a pool and then you are wiped out for 3-4 days after, we have to notice that as a you know, work it into your fatigue management. If it's absolutely you're suffering for days after, that is not a healthy pattern to have, and we would discourage that. So making sure you're exercising or doing activity safely, like I said, whether it's walking down the street, whether it's doing your housework in the garden, but we want to make sure that you are able to function the days after. And I think that's sometimes tricky to get with CMS is managing those fatigue and like Hayley said, that boom and bust. We don't want that kind of roller coaster up and down. We want to keep you more steady and level. So it's definitely a possibility, you know, to be active, and we would encourage that from a health and fitness and a muscle tone point of view. But it's making sure that you're doing it that's personalized to you.
Thanks.
There's just to touch on that, there's a couple of things. MD UK have actually got a really lovely fatigue document. I think Katie, you might have been a part of that as well. And I give that out to patients, and it talks about fatigue. It's multifactorial. It's not just activity, it's sleep, it's medication, it's diet, it's your mood. And so it's a really lovely document. MD UK have it, it's freely available. And I do use that quite a lot to kind of help guide our patients through.
Yeah, and the same, I'm going to plug MD UK again. They've got a great exercise guideline. It is general for all neuromuscular conditions, but on the back of that, it has your Borg scale, which is your breathlessness scale. So if you're starting something new, it's a good way to kind of rate how out of breath you are or how tired you might be before and after whatever kind of activity you're doing. So it is on there, so you can look it up on the MD UK information exercise sheets.
Thank you both. And it's interesting, Hayley, that you kind of touched on how the narrative's changed around exercising and activity and things like that. And I know that that's the case for other neuromuscular conditions as well. And obviously you both kind of mentioned fatigue, which comes up frequently for people who are living with muscle wasting conditions. So I was actually going to ask around, I know one of the physios that I work quite closely with talks about kind of planning, pacing and prioritising to help kind of manage day-to-day tasks and quality of life around fatigue management. So I don't know if there's anything, you know, that you want to add from that perspective. But I know also from a child perspective as well, that children, in terms of kind of keeping up with peers and things like that, it can be really difficult to manage fatigue and actually how that can impact on school. So I suppose if there's anything that you want to add to kind of expand on fatigue management from both a kind of adults and peds perspective, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, so I mean, I utilize the bags of money kind of analogy when we look at fatigue. I mean, I've probably got about 10 different ways that I will talk about managing fatigue and pacing up my sleeve. But one that seems to go down well is the idea that you've got, you know, a bag of 10 coins, and that's your coins to help you from an energy level to get through the day. And if you need to, say, use 2 of those coins, for example, just to walk to school or to do sort of an activity that we could replace with something else, i.e. could you get a lift to school, and does that allow you to have 2 coins for later in the day to do the PE or to do your homework or to hang out with friends? If you don't do that and you use all 10 coins before the day's up, and then you decide you want to do something else later, you're actually borrowing coins from tomorrow. So you're dipping into your bank account for tomorrow, and that means that tomorrow you've only got 8 coins. And so actually that often really helps people just understand, oh, if I do throw all my money, all my coins of energy on today, I really am going to crash tomorrow. And for some situations, that's okay, right? If I decided I wanted to run the town and gown, I know there's going to be a couple of days after that I'm going to be not walking very fast. But actually, we don't want that to be a spiral where you keep borrowing from tomorrow and then actually you get to the end of the week and you don't have anything left. One of the conversations I often have with some of our adults is about how they can increase their activity, and like you say, that sort of priority, that pacing, writing some kind of a diary, looking at how things do change. If I do that, what do I look like the next day or 2 days after? Often we forget how tired we were the next day. So we get into this kind of like, oh, it wasn't that bad, I'll try it again. And then we do that boom bust over time leads to decline. So we really need to stop it. So one, just as an example that we do, is if somebody can walk, say, for example, from their house to the shops, and they know that they can safely do that in 10 minutes, let's just see if we can do it in 9 minutes. So it's an activity you can do, it's safe, you can get there and get back, but maybe you're just increasing your heart rate and you're just doing something. So it's in a really safe way of increasing activity.
And definitely from my adult perspective as well, I use the same analogy as Hayley, but thinking again, if you're spending all your coins doing certain activities, could equipment help? So do we need to get occupational therapy? Do we need care and support? Is it worth looking in for kind of PA support or carers? So if you're using all your coins of energy in the morning, just getting up and washed and dressed, and then you are exhausted for the rest of the day, could we get extra help or support in? That means that you, instead of using your 5 coins for the morning routine, you're only using 2 or 3 because you've got somebody to help you get washed and dressed. And then you've got more energy to do the things that you love and enjoy. And that's the whole point of life, isn't it? To do the things that are fun and that make you happy. So if you have more energy for that, then fantastic. And that's what we're aiming for, really.
Thank you both very much. So there's quite a few questions in the Q&A, so I'll just go back through some of these. So there's 2 kind of similar questions. So someone has asked, is CMS associated with heat and cold intolerance? And someone else has asked, why does heat and humidity make CMS worse? So I'll just open that up to the panel if anyone's able to come in and answer.
Yeah. So it is sort of a temperature change, particularly heat. So we know not just CMS, myasthenia patients do feel much worse in hot weather, humid weather. And we think that is related to how, in Dr. Dong he talked about the chloride, the safety factor, that's prolonged. So actually the neuromuscular transmission is not as effective in hot weather. Equally, we do know our patients with myasthenia, other physiological changes like menstruation, pregnancy also can affect this thing. But yeah, heat certainly is a factor. It doesn't mean you never go out in the summer, but it's just being aware of that, making sure you cool down this thing, you're well hydrated. Yeah, and making sure, you're not out in the sun for too long. But yeah, heat can be a factor. Cold doesn't particularly make CMS worse or, myasthenia worse.
Thanks, Dr. Alice.
If I just add to that, the reason why heat makes most myasthenic patients worse is that it's the pure physical electrical signaling. So if you imagine your nerve and your muscles are behaving almost like wires in terms of they're conducting electricity through. So heat generally increases the resistance to conduction, and that's why you can imagine you already have an inefficient system for communicating. It's what gives you the myasthenia. So being hotter, increasing that resistance will make that conductivity worse. So it's kind of a physical thing, but there is a subtype of CMS in which I think it's the GMPVs where we've heard patients tell us that the cold made them worse. So we don't understand why that is, but that's another it can go both ways in certain subtypes.
Thanks, Dr. Dong. Dr. Ramdas, you'd mentioned there in your answer about pregnancy as well. So someone's actually asked in the chat, could pregnancy exacerbate symptoms of CMS? And I suppose if anyone's got anything else to add around why that might be or how that could be managed.
So yes, so we had there was a study that we looked at our patients with CMS, had gone through pregnancy. Yes, in some of them, I think in about 40% of them, pregnancy didn't get their symptoms but worse, but most of them got back to their baseline after pregnancy. I think it's important to remember that, planning your pregnancy well in advance is really important for patients who have CMS. Make sure your treatments are optimal, you're otherwise in a good health state. Equally with pregnancy, it's important to know, which I didn't mention this thing, is all the drugs that we use in CMS are not licensed for CMS. So these are drugs which are used in CMS, they've been purposed for other conditions, so they're not licensed. And particularly with some of them, like 3,4-DAP, we do not have any data on, what it could affect the baby, the fetus and risk. So those are discussions you need to have with your neurologist well in advance about, making sure your pregnancy, your treatments are optimal, what would be risk of, what are the side effects of medications that you take in pregnancy and breastfeeding. But it's important that you continue your CMS treatments, where possible during your pregnancy. But most patients who do get worse during pregnancy do get back to their baseline after pregnancy. It's only a small proportion where their symptoms remain, are more severe than they were before they got pregnant. And also just to add, our patients who do get pregnant, they, all of them continue, most of them would continue to have normal pregnancies and delivery. So there's no higher risk of, cesarean sections, things like that. But it's important, they're managed by an obstetric team to discuss, how they manage the delivery. You don't want someone fatiguing, getting tired through a prolonged labor with CMS. You might need to consider, a cesarean section and induction earlier, sooner compared to someone, who doesn't have CMS.
Thank you.
So Dara, sorry, just to touch on that, that's often something we do talk about in clinic, isn't it? Sort of not necessarily the medication during pregnancy, but sort of postpartum, how if you have a mother who is weak or who has had to change her medication through pregnancy, getting back to all of a sudden you've now got to manage not just you, but a small child who you've now got to carry and lift around, and the fatigue that comes with just being a new mother. And so actually we do often give quite a lot of advice around that kind of in clinic. So if you are pregnant, even just, you're thinking about the here and now, just think about the future as well. And those are questions that, everyone's unique, everyone will have different levels of support, but, utilizing equipment, utilizing people around you to help support that is something that is addressed in clinic.
Thanks, Hayley. Thanks both. So there's just another question around whether CMS is progressive, or like other kind of myasthenic conditions or myasthenia conditions. Is there periods of time where people could be symptom free in relation to kind of medication and treatment and things like that as well?
Leanne, go for it. Yeah.
Okay. I was just going to comment because with the cohort paper, I've looked at everybody, and so it's interesting. It depends on the subtypes, and some subtypes are a bit milder than others. Like we know the Rapsons can be quite severe when they're small, but once they kind of get to the second decade, so from 10 on, they do quite well. And we have quite a number of the Rapson patients who are, not taking any medication or just taking pyridostigmine when they need it. Same with the Epsilon patients. Quite a few of them are quite mild, and some of them don't take medication, and they continue to be quite mild. And again, so it can kind of, but there are some of the Epsilon patients who are a bit more severe and have gotten, like they don't tend to get worse, but it just depends on there's difference in the subtypes and between the subtypes. So it's kind of hard to say, but typically we found, with DOC7 patients, we'd say at least half of them seem to progress in terms of their respiratory function would tend to decline. So that's why we keep a close eye on that. But in terms of, motor weakness and basically disability and needing a wheelchair, having looked at the whole cohort, I haven't found that, a significant portion, like, more than 20% would end up requiring a wheelchair or anything like that down the track. So they, again, it would depend on your subtype, but the severity, the really severe, needing a wheelchair and needing a NIV or ventilator, and that those people are in the minority.
Thank you. Dr. Ramdas, did you want to add anything? No.
No, just going to add, there is a type like the glycosylation defects, or where they can have an underlying what we call a myopathy, which can slowly progress, but again over decades, not over years, which doesn't respond to treatment. So just another. So yeah, so most CMSs are stable, but there are a few where the muscle weakness or likely answer the respiratory muscle involvement can progress in adult life.
Thank you. And I suppose in relation to the kind of medication aspect, the treatment aspect, at what point would that generally be reviewed? So if someone is noticing changes to their condition, or kind of in relation to like significant milestones like, puberty or pregnancy and things like that, as well as the different stages that might be looked at if the medication's not working in the way that it was?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, so it depends at what time point a patient is diagnosed with CMS. So when you diagnose a little baby, medications reviewed at every appointment, first thing. But in little infants, children, we do medications based on weight and this thing. So you might need to optimize based on their weight. Equally, you might have patients, who initially, you start on a small dose, build up, and, keep on a medium dose, they were tolerating well, but puberty, growth spurt, things decline, we might need to optimize treatment then. So there are different stages, and generally you keep patients on the lowest dose, which is tolerated but effective, but some might need higher doses even if previously the doses were effective. So it's a review that you do every time you see them in clinic. And important also to factor side effects, because CMS medicines do have side effects which may not be tolerated. So you might need to keep sometimes patients on lower doses because the side effects are much higher.
Thank you. Tracy, I just wonder if I can come back to you for a minute as well. So one of the questions that we'd had was around specific support for kind of teenagers and things like that. So I think obviously teenage years can be really challenging anyway, but when people are living with conditions, it can be particularly difficult. Does myAware have anything specifically to offer to kind of children or teenagers or parents of teenagers, or is there anything that you might recommend or kind of signpost to?
Yeah, so again, we would the clinical side of things is tricky, obviously, with everybody being so different. We do have specific Zoom sessions for parents of children with CMS or any of the myasthenias, and likewise we have Zoom sessions for the under 18s as well. So it's recommending wise is slightly tricky, because we don't have the specialist knowledge, obviously, that the teams have around the country that people see, but as far as support goes, we can kind of bring those people with CMS together virtually, whether it be the parents of or the children with, just to kind of take the isolation feeling away, because I think sometimes when you're living with a rare condition, not knowing anybody else with a rare condition can be quite tricky. So we do try and bring them together in that sense, but we don't have any specific advice for teenagers, but it is certainly pregnancy and being pregnant with myasthenia and with CMS is something we're looking at, as well as how women are affected generally through the cycles. So that is something we are currently looking at the moment. That it seems to be an area where there is little information. So hopefully, with starting with the myasthenia side of things, we'll be able to move on to the CMS specific things. And I'm sure we'll probably be reaching out to some of the people on the panel today for their advice.
Thanks, Tracy. I know from Muscular Dystrophy UK's perspective as well, when parents kind of get in contact looking for support for teenagers or kind of younger children, we encourage parents to use our kind of closed groups like our Facebook group and our, to link in with other parents as well to see if there's anyone who lives kind of nearby and things like that as well that they can connect with.
We have a welfare rights officer actually, and she's able to help with getting schools to kind of understand the condition, and we have kind of resources in that sense. So because I think that can be quite tricky, but yeah, nothing specific at the moment.
Thanks, Tracy.
Okay.
So just to go back to some of the questions in the Q&A, someone's asked about, so what they've said is that their wrist has been getting weaker over the past year. and with regular use they start to experience pain as well. So I suppose, is pain associated, kind of musculoskeletal pain, is that associated with CMS? And could the cause of the pain and the weakness be as a result of CMS, or could it be in relation to something else?
I think it probably is relation to something else. Pain would not be a feature of CMS. So it's something they probably speak to their neurologist about.
Okay, thank you very much.
Just to add in, sometimes wrists can, because it's quite a slim kind of joint and it's a little bit more exposed. So if you have got kind of a little bit of muscle weakness around here, it doesn't take much to kind of upset the joint and the smaller bones. So definitely get it checked out, probably with the physio team, from whether it's a neuro or a musculoskeletal team. They should be able to look, because there might be something else going on. But supports and splints might also help kind of support the joint a little bit more. Wrists are always really prone to arthritis and other kind of wear and tear in the joints as well. So it could be linked to that.
Thanks, Katie. So there's just a question in the Q&A, and I know it's always really difficult to comment on, you know, when it's specific circumstances or relating to someone's kind of individual circumstances. But if anyone's able to answer this kind of from a broader perspective. So someone's commented to say, in slow channel, as you mentioned, pyridoxysteamine is not helpful, but it can deteriorate the situation. In this person's case, they've been taking it since 2008 and found it has been helpful. Although they have also started with fluoxetine and salbutamol as well.
I think it's very difficult to discuss an individual case
Yeah.
without seeing the patient or what the genetics is thing. So I think it needs a discussion with a neurologist. And we do support neurologists across the UK. They regularly email us, telephone. So that might be a way to, yeah, if they reach out to us, we can discuss the case. It's very difficult to advise based on. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. No, that's great. Thank you very much. So we just have one final question in the Q&A, so we've managed to get through them all. So thank you so much to everybody for their input. Someone's commented to say it's important to recognise reasons for fluctuations in CMS, which can happen for a whole range of other factors. And it's important for people to be patient around that as well. So things like, you know, dealing with family, work. So this person's not fully dosed for DOC7 CMS, and they've had to be creative about how they manage things. They've discovered some things which are helpful, but it's not always kind of following the norm for CMS. Being able to change and adapt even during the day, let alone the week, the month and the year, is really important to them. And they're just asking, is this something that's discussed in clinic? That actually it could be very unique to individual circumstances and kind of, you know, how it might, how someone's condition might kind of change or progress.
Yeah, I was going to look at both our physios, but yeah, absolutely. I think from medical, we know CMS fluctuates. It's not the same for each patient, you know, how it fluctuates on a weekly basis, monthly basis, daily basis, you know, hours of the day. So absolutely. And it's finding what works for you best. And it can be, you know, very individual to each patient. It depends on, you know, are you at school? Are you at uni? What work you do? You know, are you caring for children, school drop off? There's so many factors which influence, you know, how you manage your myasthenia and muscle condition. But yeah, Haley and Katie.
Thanks, Sitar. I didn't want to talk in front of you, but I mean, you're just like a perfect physio. We can just get you to do our work. Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. There's so many other factors, and I think sometimes we do run the risk of hanging a lot of you know, symptoms or concerns on a diagnosis that we've been given. So I have CMS is the way that I'm presenting related to that. And actually, we're all individuals. If I worked in an outpatients clinic that wasn't CMS related, no two patients would come in with the same lifestyle choices, the way they manage, the way they exercise, how they can cope. And so just because you've been put into a category of you've got CMS as well, doesn't mean you all now become the same. So yes, we do have all those individual conversations. Obviously, we talk about CMS itself. We know how that affects your body. We will assess, we will talk about your lifestyle choices, what activity you're up to, what family situation, social situation you're in. So everybody is an individual, and we do have to have those discussions, and there will be some similarities, and that allows us that's important because that allows us to draw on evidence. You know, if we do cohort people together, we can see a pattern, and that helps reassure people. Oh yes, we see that in lots of other people. But just because we don't doesn't mean that it's not true or valid symptom. And we just manage that kind of as it comes through. So yes, it's absolutely. I hope I've answered that clearly, that we do talk about all those things in clinic.
Thanks, Hayley. Katie, is there anything that you want to add to that?
Yeah, just to add, everyone is an individual. It is really hard, and you can't compare yourself even without any condition. You know, you're always comparing yourself to your friends or your peers or on social media. So it is really difficult. And I think it's just, you know, to say we all have different bodies. We all have different types of, you know, muscle, and our genetics are different. We age at different age. We get, especially as ladies, we hit the menopause or perimenopause at different ages, and all these things have a huge impact on how we move and live, and our fatigue and how we get on. So everybody, we just have to take as an individual and try and work within kind of them personally. So that's why it's so good to try and link in with your physios or your specialist teams, to have kind of bespoke or custom made programs for you, or talk rather than going kind of a bit more generic. So yeah, please kind of get in touch and link in with your local services.
Thank you very much. So that's as we've managed to get through the questions that we can answer in our Q&A. I just wanted to come back to Tracy again from myAware, who's joined us today. Tracy, are you happy to share just the best way for people to get in contact with myAware, and also just a kind of a quick overview of support that myAware can provide to people living with myasthenic conditions as well?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So we've got a phone line and an email address, and I can pop those in the chat for you, so people can copy that. We have a website with lots of resources on there, which is available for people. All of our, just to mention, all of our services are completely free, but we do ask for people to be a member of myAware. Membership is lifelong for however long you want it, and is completely free as well. So if that's accessing Charlie, who's the Welfare Rights Officer, to do anything to deal with employment issues, school issues, any benefits that you might be able to apply for, and help in filling out those forms, then that's all free advice as well. As say, are the Zooms that we provide. So we provide Zooms for everybody at the end of every month, and then we do specific Zoom sessions for people with CMS, LEMS, a young generation group, which are 18 to 39, and also obviously ones for parents and ones for children as well. So we're also one-to-one support by email, by phone, by Zoom. However people prefer to be supported, we can certainly try and you know, build that relationship, and obviously help people build their own connections and relationships within the CMS group, because as I say, as mentioned beforehand, it can be quite a lonely and concerning place sometimes, where whoever you are in the journey, whether you're a parent, carer, supporter of, or person with the condition. So we try and holistically look after and support everybody as best we can. So yeah, I'll put the details in the chat for you, and if there's anything, you know, specifically we can help with, all the support emails and our direct emails are on the website as well.
That's brilliant, Tracy. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
So as we come to the end of today's session, we'd like to thank all our speakers for sharing their time and expertise, and a big thank you to all our attendees for their questions, comments and engagement throughout the session as well. So the recording of this seminar, along with others in the series, will be available soon on our website. We'll also be sending out a really brief feedback survey, so we'd appreciate if you can take a moment to complete it, as it helps us to plan and improve any future events. So I had shared the details at the beginning of today's seminar, but you can contact our free helpline on 0800 652 6352. We are open Monday to Thursday, 10 AM to 2 PM. You can also email us at info@musculardystrophyuk.org. I'd also share details about our research team as well, so you can reach out to our research team via email on research@musculardystrophyuk.org. So just a final reminder, so while today's session provides valuable information, it doesn't replace advice from your healthcare team. So if you do have specific concerns or questions about your health or care, we do encourage you to speak with your neuromuscular specialist or your clinical team. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us today, and we hope you found it useful and informative. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for having us. Bye-bye.
Bye.